Permission to come aboard granted. Welcome aboard the Story Ship. I'm so glad to be here with you today. We have an exciting guest. His name is Stewart Mann, and I like to think of him as the American ambassador of storytelling. Do you know what an ambassador is? An ambassador is someone that represents your country. They go to other countries and tell them about your culture and what you're interested in. Today, Stewart Mann is definitely an American ambassador of storytelling. He travels all over the world telling stories. And today he's here with us to tell us a story about letting go. Have you ever been afraid of letting go of something or doing something you just didn't want to do? Like maybe clean up your room, take out the garbage, go back to school, or letting go of that blanket that you've had for years or the pillow that you loved so much. Well, today, Barry's story is about letting go. And this is a story that fits for everyone, even adults. Sometimes adults don't want to let go of jobs they don't want to do anymore, or move on with somebody that's already moved on without them. Let's have a listen to Stewart Mann's story about letting go.
Good grief, the leaf. Well, it was autumn, and things were changing. The air was getting colder, the wind was starting to blow, and the leaves were falling off the trees, and almost all the leaves had fallen off the trees, but there was one leaf that was still holding on, and that leaf was named Good Grief. And that leaf said, "Good grief, I don't want to fall off my tree. I want to keep holding on. It's fun to be on a tree. I don't want to just fall to the ground. Good grief." Well, the weather was getting cold, and there in the forest there were a lot of bears. Now, you might know what bears do in the wintertime. I bet you do. Bears do something called hibernating. They go into caves, they go under tree trunks, and they sleep for most of the winter. And most of the bears were doing that. But there was one bear who didn't want to do it. And that bear was named I Don't Care. And I Don't Care said, "I don't care if all the bears are going into caves and sleeping. I don't feel like sleeping. I want to keep out in the woods and climbing trees and running around and being on rocks. I don't care." So, Good Grief, the leaf said, "Good grief." And I Don't Care, the bear said, "I don't care." Well, meanwhile, up in the sky, there were a lot of birds, and you might know this as well, that when the weather is getting cold, the birds will fly to where the weather is warmer. The birds were flying to the south, and there were lots of geese flying through the air. They would fly in formations. It looked like a big V with the point heading forward. But there was one goose that wasn't flying to the south. That goose was named What's the Use? And that goose said, "What's the use? What's the use of flying to the south? I'll just turn around and fly back to the north, and then to the south, and north and south and north, and back and forth, and south and north, and back and forth. What's the use?" So, Good Grief, the leaf said, "Good grief." And I Don't Care, the bear said, "I don't care." And What's the Use, the goose said, "What's the use?" Well, meanwhile, nearby there was a farm, and on the farm, all of the fruits and vegetables were turning ripe and getting ready to be picked, and the farmers were out picking all that wonderful food to be brought to farmers' markets and sold to people to be put on their tables. But on one farm, there was a squash named Oh My Gosh, and a pumpkin named Grumpkin the pumpkin, and a corn named Forlorn the corn. Forlorn means sad. Then Forlorn the corn and Grumpkin the pumpkin and Oh My Gosh the squash said, "We don't want to be picked. We just want to stay here on our vines and stay here on our plants and stay here on our stalks, and we're just happy being where we are. We don't want to end up on somebody's table. We don't want to be picked." So, Good Grief the Leaf said, "Good grief." And I Don't Care the Bear said, "I don't care." And What's the Use the Goose said, "What's the use?" And Grumpkin the Pumpkin and Forlorn the Corn and Oh My Gosh the Squash said, "We don't want to be picked." Well, nearby there was an ocean, and in the ocean, the whales were swimming to the south because just like the geese, they knew that they had to get to warmer waters. And all the whales were heading towards the southern oceans, except for one whale who didn't want to go. His name was Why Bother? And he said, "Why bother? Why should I swim south? I'll just turn around and swim back north and south and north and back and forth. Why bother?" So, Good Grief the Leaf said, "Good grief." And I Don't Care the Bear said, "I don't care." And What's the Use the Goose said, "What's the use?" And Grumpkin the Pumpkin and Forlorn the Corn and Oh My Gosh the Squash said, "We don't want to be picked." And Why Bother the Whale said, "Why bother?" And they all stayed right where they were. But luckily, along came a turtle. The turtle came walking up over a hill and through the woods. Dum-ba-dum-ba-dum-ba-dum-ba-dum. The turtle's name was Time to Move On. And Time to Move On, the turtle looked at all of these creatures not doing what they were supposed to do. And so Time to Move On went over to Good Grief and said, "What are you doing?" And Good Grief said, "Good grief, I don't want to get picked. I just want to stay on my branch." But Time to Move On said, "Don't you know that leaves need to fall to the ground because then they will become the soil for the flowers and the plants to grow in the new year?" And Good Grief said, "Good grief, I didn't realize that. I guess I better fall." And so Good Grief let go and fluttered to the ground. And Time to Move On went to I Don't Care the Bear and said, "What are you doing? Why aren't you going into a cave?" "I don't care. I don't feel like going in a cave. I want to stay out." But Time to Move On said, "Don't you know, if you don't go in a cave and sleep, you won't be healthy enough to take care of your cubs in the spring?" And I Don't Care the Bear said, "I don't care, but I do care about my cubs, so I guess I better go and hibernate." And so I Don't Care went and crawled into a nearby cave. And Time to Move On looked up in the sky and said, "What are you doing up there?" And What's the Use the Goose said, "What's the use? Why should I fly south? I'll just come back." But Time to Move On said, "Don't you know, if you stay here where it's cold, it'll probably freeze you. You'll get sick. You have to fly to the south and then come back in the spring." And What's the Use said, "What's the use of arguing? I guess I better do what I should do." And so she went flying towards the south. And Time to Move On went to the farm and said, "Why aren't you letting yourselves get picked?" And those three, Oh My Gosh the Squash and Forlorn the Corn and Grumpkin the Pumpkin said, "We don't want to be picked. We don't want to end up on somebody's table." But Time to Move On said, "Oh, but that's your job. You're ripe and you're ready, and if you stay on your vine, you'll rot, and you'll make someone so happy if you become food on their table." And they said, "Well, we don't want to be picked, but maybe we should." And just then along came a farmer and picked them. And Time to Move On went by the ocean and called out, "Why aren't you swimming south?" "Why bother? I might as well stay here. I'll be coming back in a few months." "But don't you know that if you stay here, you might get frozen in the ice, and then you'll be too cold, and you might not even survive, or you certainly won't be able to take care of your baby whales?" And Why Bother said, "Whoa, I guess I better bother. I better swim south." And so he took off. And when Time to Move On looked around and saw that now everyone was doing what they were supposed to do, and he knew what he needed to do. It was time for him to move on. And that's my story, called Good Grief, the Leaf.
Wow. Excellent. Wow, I love that. I got to thinking about all the times I felt like, why bother? And oh, good grief.
Yeah, well, we don't have maybe the same seasonal jobs to do, but we definitely have jobs to do that there are times we just don't feel like bothering. We feel like it's just going to be the same thing the next day, but we all have our jobs to do. We have to move on. We have to grow older. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to accept new responsibilities.
That is so true. And believe it or not, if we do, we generally feel better about ourselves and what's going on in our lives. So it is important. Absolutely. You did a wonderful job. And I really, really want to say thank you for coming out and being part of the Story Ship's journey today. We had quite a voyage. Boys and girls, I want to invite you to visit Barry online at barrystewartmann.com. Teachers and parents, you can see him online there. You can find out all about his shows and book him too. Please take advantage of such an incredible storyteller. He's got lots to offer you. And I want to also remind you to visit us online at TheStoryShip.com, where you can find out about our podcasting workshops and also find out about our performances too. That's TheStoryShip.com. Thanks for visiting with us, everybody. Happy listening. The Story Ship podcast is available on iTunes, Google Play, Amazon Alexa, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or Podbean.